Hi, welcome everybody to another Album of Record podcast. I'm Craig Lyndall, joined as always by Andrew Schnitkey. How's it going, Andrew?
It's going pretty good. I am pretty excited for tonight's episode. We're probably going to talk about several different shows and albums, but specifically going to talk about an album that means a lot to me personally. So I'm excited to talk about that and to get into this subject in general.
Yeah, we're going to talk about Unplugged. And we're definitely going to spend a lot of time focusing on Alice in Chains Unplugged. You can't talk about this topic at all without mentioning Nirvana Unplugged, as we all know. But before we get to the main topic, there's an exciting bit of news that came across the timeline this afternoon. A band that you and I both love, Thursday, kind of that early 2000s emo, screamo, I don't know, whatever, alternative rock, whatever you want to call them. They're releasing the first song in over a decade, maybe. I think they said 13 years. They're doing it without a label. By this time tomorrow, we will have listened to the song multiple times.
Yeah, they Thursday is a band that I absolutely love. If someday if we do an episode of our top concert moments, this may or may not make my list, but Thursdays seeing them live was incredible. And when they played Autumn Leaves Revisited at the last time I saw them, just that performance was just, it like stopped me in my tracks. It was so good. So, and it's funny because I wasn't expecting this. I didn't even know that they were talking to each other, or that, no clue that this was in the works. When Craig sent me the message that, hey, Thursday has a song coming out tomorrow, I was completely blown away, just absolutely freaked out. Like, holy cow. Like, I'm so happy to hear what a new Thursday song might sound like.
When I got to see them recently on the 20th anniversary tour for Full Collapse. It was a really just a religious experience type of a show. For all the negativity and the angst that flows through that band and their lyrics, their shows are just a celebration of being together. Jeff Rickley, the lead singer, he's like a cheerleader up there. And it was just awesome. And by the way, not this last time, although it was great, but early on when they first debuted Jet Black New Year live, the first time I saw them play Jet Black New Year live has got to be one of the greatest musical moments of my life. Just an incredible performance and one of the most powerful songs that you could see live.
I think, you touched a little bit on it. Like, I think Jeff is one of the more endearing frontmen, especially in like that genre of music. And, Thursday is a relatively big band. I mean, they were not playing like the tiny clubs, like, they were playing shows where there's a separation, like they're on, the stage, and it's you're seeing this band, but somehow he made it always feel like a communal spirit, like we were just all there to celebrate music together. And I love that aspect about Thursday. It's just incredible band. Very, very excited.
Yeah, and maybe the song stinks. I guess we'll find out.
I was going to mention too, like when I read that they were doing this without a label, it was kind of funny. Not haha funny, I suppose, because I'm sure this is still sensitive to Jeff, but infamously he was involved with the label with the
Martin Shkreli, the
Martin
Farmer Bro.
Shkreli, and he really got burned by that deal. He let him finance the label they were working on, and a lot of bands got hurt in that. And I know it was personally embarrassing, I'm sure, for Jeff. I don't think anybody holds Jeff accountable for that. I mean, I don't view it as really a negative on his part. He was suckered just like everybody else was. But I remember when that happened, it was just like, oh my God, like I felt so bad that it was happening specifically to him. I was like, he just seemed like the last guy that you would expect to be involved with something like that. So maybe that could be some scars there, that maybe they're like, let's not do a label thing. Let's just put this music out ourselves. So, yeah.
All right, let's dive in. Let's talk about MTV Unplugged, one of the most influential TV shows, parts of MTV from our youth. But first, a trivia question. I don't know how much homework you did. What year was MTV Unplugged first launched?
I know it was in the 80s, actually. I want to say like 86, maybe.
See, I was shocked, man. It was 1989, and
Oh,
it was
89. Was that
it
late?
was a different show. It was hosted by American singer-songwriter Jules Shear and featured Aerosmith, Elton John, Sinead O'Connor, Poison, Joe Satriani, and Stevie Ray Vaughan, among others.
Okay.
I had no idea. So the first, I think the first real unplugged that I remember was probably Eric Clapton in '92.
For sure. Tears in Heaven off of that was ubiquitous at that time. The version of Layla is awesome.
Did you like it?
it, I didn't like Tears in Heaven. I liked Layla. Um, yeah, Tears in Heaven, not so much. I actually now really like that Clapton album. I don't listen to like. It was probably just a couple years ago. One of the writers at the sports website we have or had waiting for next year, Michael Bodie, he turned me on to Clapton, and I was like, like give me some places to start with Clapton. I wanted to I'd never really done a dive and like really actually listen to his albums. And so I started getting into some of the albums, and there's some really good stuff in there, but it's one of those things like you walk away from something like that, like it's too daunting to ever do a full deep dive and like really get into Eric Clapton today. But kind of my takeaway from that is that if I'm going to listen to something now, it actually is unplugged. Like that's the thing I came away with. There's a lot of stuff that I really love on that, but I still don't love Tears in Heaven. Actually, not crazy about that song.
Yeah, I didn't like the whole thing. I thought it was lame in the moment. I thought it was like, all right, this may be MTV, but they're playing it on adult contemporary. I've got the guitar solo for Layla memorized in my
Mm-hmm.
brain, even though I don't like it. Um, it was just not my thing at all. And as a 13-year-old who was awash in that everywhere you went, it's hard to explain to anybody the ubiquity of albums like that between MTV, between VH1, every every radio station, every grocery store, every CVS. It was probably Revco in those days. I don't even remember, but you couldn't go anywhere without hearing Eric Clapton Unplugged, and it was just too much for me. I couldn't handle it.
Yeah, no, I get that, and like I said, I wasn't into it at that time. Other than I did like Layla. I thought Layla was pretty cool, but yeah, it was definitely inescapable. I certainly know plenty of friends who had that album at that time. It truly was one of the earlier like breakout albums that I like really remember that like spanned across like generations too. Like, certainly generations older than us were definitely into it, but there was a decent amount of kids at my school who got into that Unplugged album in general.
Yeah. So do you remember Mariah Carey Unplugged when she covered "I'll Be There" by the Jackson Five?
Yeah, I don't really I don't remember it as in like I remember the performance, but I certainly remember that being played on the radio.
It was everywhere. I'm trying to
Yeah.
pick out some of the unplugged moments that really kind of escaped out of the MTV culture and onto the radio.
Yeah, I remember Neil Young's. I remember that was a pretty big one that a lot of people were really into. I think if I remember correctly, didn't they did a compilation out CD, right? MTV Unplugged, where it was like one song from a bunch of people who had done it. This is we call it like sort of the pre Nirvana, pre Pearl Jam era of Unplugged, but I think there was a compilation CD if I remember correctly. I think one of my friends had that. I seem to recall that.
It
But
sounds
yeah,
familiar. I can't remember it. I don't remember having a copy. But
I definitely didn't have a copy of it, but
so Roxette did one. I don't really remember that one. I do vaguely remember Midnight Oil, The Beds Are Burning, that band.
Yeah.
Peter Garrett, the
Nice
he
bald guy.
yeah, he shaved his head bald before it was cool.
That's right.
Um, and then Soul Asylum did one, and their
Oh, that's
cover,
right.
they did that cover of To Sir With Love with Lulu, the original singer,
Mm.
which was kind of a crossover moment in my house because my parents remembered that song and they remembered Lulu, and they were like, "Who's
Okay.
this band, Soul Asylum?" And that was
That's right.
shortly
I
after
forgot that they did that. Yeah.
I'd seen Soul Asylum
Hmm.
on the Grave Dancers Union tour. So I was all in on Soul Asylum in 1993, 92,
Yeah.
93.
Yeah.
And then we had Rod Stewart. I don't need to talk about that. Do you need to talk
I
about that?
No. I do remember that being a thing. I
Yeah.
actually do, but I have nothing to say about Rod Stewart.
Duran Duran.
I have no memory of that.
I don't really either.
I don't even like remember that being a thing.
No. And then finally, then we get to Nirvana, which was kind of the
Although
of all. Yes.
chronologically, that's after Pearl Jam. So Pearl Jam's Unplugged was kind of a forgotten thing. It aired on TV, and they never released it. They didn't release an album of it. They didn't release video of it. So it was
You're
this
right.
thing that
March 1992, Pearl Jam did their Unplugged, and I remember it being on TV, and I had the VHS. I had a VHS recording of it off the TV.
It was yes, that's what, and it was passed around the bootleg circles, like the Pearl Jam bootleg circles. Everybody would pass around and dub this video that somebody recorded off a TV of Pearl Jam's Unplugged performance, and it was incredible. It was so good. And it was just funny that they just never did anything with it. Now today, I can't remember if it was
as an album,
but was it with the 10 or the Versus remaster? I can't remember. It came out with one of them. They did it like at the same time as one of the like re-releases, and that was like a bonus thing that they finally released properly released the Unplugged. So you can go and stream it now. But
what are the big memories for you from Pearl Jam's MTV Unplugged? Like, what are the iconic moments?
I mean, obviously it's Porch, Ed surfing on his stool and writing on his pro-choice on his arm. That was definitely a formative thing. Can
I stop you right there real quick?
Yeah.
Because I liked Porch from the album 10. I liked it. But seeing it on Unplugged made me love it. It brought that song to a totally different level for me.
The intensity of that performance specifically was incredible. I remember also just how incredible State of Love and Trust is Unplugged even. Like, that's a ridiculously great song in its own right, but it kind of goes to show that when you can translate it that powerfully as well into an acoustic version like that, it kind of just speaks to the strength of that song just in and of itself. Like, so I remember that. I remember like, I want to say one of the songs, didn't Jeff throw his bass at the end? I'm pretty sure if you remember, right as they were done, he launched his bass in the air and like a tech in the back like caught it. I remember that. Mike's solos were awesome. To hear somebody just shred on an acoustic guitar like that was cool. Like, Pearl Jam managed to bring like a lot of bands when they would go on Unplugged obviously would really like strip things down and try and find a more basic version of them to play to the mood and the atmosphere. Pearl Jam somehow managed to maintain sort of that same intensity that they were known for in their live shows at that time, especially. They managed to bring that same energy into that Unplugged show. It's definitely one of the most energetic Unplugged albums that are out there for sure.
Yeah, and I can't remember which song they originally left off the TV broadcast. It might have been Even Flow. But then they played it separately as a video. Even back in the day, it was like hard to kind of get all of it at once. And then apparently there's a version of Rockin' in the Free World that I've never even heard that they played.
I didn't know
that's
that
never
either.
aired anywhere.
Huh. Yeah, I didn't even know that.
Yeah. So yeah, that I kind of I was looking at the Wikipedia and it hadn't been listed, so I missed out
Because
on
it's
the
funny because
chronology.
it's out of order chronologically, and like you made the same mistake so many people did that they don't realize that Pearl Jam like was one of the first like of the well, they really were the first of the grunge bands to do Unplugged. And not to get too deep in the weeds on this, but they had played a show over in Europe somewhere. I don't remember where, but it was like there was like this time. It wasn't even a stage. This had to have been 91 probably. They were in just some tiny little corner of this room, and they were like, "Well, we cannot fit all of our instruments up here. Like, can we play an acoustic show?" So they went to a music store like around the corner, got some acoustic instruments, and played an acoustic show there. And there's some bootleg video of this out there, and it's awesome.
Yeah.
But that sort of gave them the idea, like that when MTV approached them, they were basically like, "Well, we did it once before. Like, let's just do that again." And that's kind of where that whole idea came from them for them. And that's something too that when you talk about Unplugged, and it's a recurring theme when you hear people talk about doing Unplugged. And we'll get into this a little bit with Jerry Cantrell, but they talk about how intimidating Unplugged is. Like, it's one thing to go and stand on a stage in front of a rowdy crowd, and you plug in all your instruments, and the distortion can hide some of the mistakes you might make, but like you're really vulnerable playing an acoustic intimate show like that, and it's intimidating for a lot of bands. And so I think for Pearl Jam, I think it was just helpful for them that they had the confidence to do it because they had already tried it just out of necessity. And I think it made that transition a little more seamless for them.
So I think that kind of gets us to MTV Unplugged by Nirvana.
Yeah.
Um, and I mean, of all the bands that did Unplugged, it probably did as much for Nirvana as it could have done for anybody. Um, I mean, I guess some of it's based on the timing, but all the covers that they did and
Mm-hmm.
showing that they didn't need to play all their biggest hits in order to create an iconic performance. I'm sure producers were terrified that they're doing a Meat Puppet song and they're doing a David Bowie cover and all this seemingly out of context
Lead
stuff
Belly,
that
the Lead
Lead
Belly
Belly.
cover.
And then, of course, it turns out to be, I think it would have been one of the most iconic performances, even if Kurt doesn't die, but
Yeah.
there's no way of knowing.
Yeah. That album is really interesting because it's, Nirvana was always sort of one speed. And I don't mean that in a negative way at all, but like Nirvana was very much of like they had cut their path and they had gone down that. And whereas like, other bands had done a lot of like collaborations and things like that. Like I just saw I don't know if you know the YouTube channel Music is Win, the guitar channel.
No.
Tyler, I forget what his last name is. But anyways, he's a great guitarist. He has this awesome YouTube channel. He just talks about guitars and music and stuff. And he actually just, I think it was today, had a video about Kurt and talking about how Kurt Cobain like once said that, he had a quote where he said something like, music theory is worthless and that he doesn't even like it, and he thinks that it's too limiting and that it stifles creativity. And Tyler kind of talks about like he's like that's fine if you're Kurt Cobain. Like Kurt Cobain was a singular musical genius. Like very few people can just write songs without caring about music theory to
Like a
some
savant.
degree. Yeah, I mean, he was definitely a savant. Like Tyler was demonstrating how like a couple different songs, like they aren't in any key. Like they're just in like not very many people have the musical ear to write music like that. But he also talks about how he's like musical theory is part of what allows you to collaborate. And he did talk about how for as great as Kurt was and a singular genius that he was, he didn't write music or play on other people's albums. He did do some, like he sang on Mark Lanigan's album. He might have done a couple other things, but like, he wasn't out there doing side projects and being like an improv guy, like, because maybe he didn't have that background. But where that ties into Unplugged is because it did show that side of him. All of a sudden, he was playing Meat Puppets songs with the Meat Puppets. He was covering other people's songs, and it demonstrated a entirely different vibe to Nirvana than what we had ever heard from them. Like for as much as you would have your Pennyroyal Tea or your Polly or like some of the softer songs that they might have in their catalog, like, you really didn't get this entire side of Nirvana where they would really explore a little bit more space musically. And I think that's what's so cool about Unplugged, is because it was so uncharacteristic of what we expected out of Nirvana at that time.
Yeah, absolutely. And then, of course, he just took songs and made them his own. I mean,
Yeah.
If you've listened to the original "Where Did You Sleep Last Night" by Leadbelly or some of those Meat Puppet songs, the Kurt versions, he really made them his own, and kind of redefined those songs. Even a song like "The Man Who Sold the World,"
Mm-hmm.
the version that Nirvana put together on Unplugged is uniquely theirs. And
Yeah.
that's also, by the way, that's also the sign of somebody who doesn't understand a lot about music theory. And I speak a little bit from experience, not that I'm of that level, but back when I had my band and we wrote songs, it was much easier for me to write a song myself and then teach it to everybody. But covers were really hard because then I had to be knowledgeable enough to understand what like Tom York was thinking if we wanted to cover Radiohead. And it was like, I can't, I, I gotta stay in my lane, in my little corner of the world. It's hard. You have to be really accomplished to extend yourself outside. It's like when I hear people trash cover bands or tribute bands, I'm like, you can trash the concept, but from a difficulty standpoint or a degree of difficulty standpoint, what they're doing is phenomenally hard, phenomenally difficult.
Yeah. I think, I'll also speak a little bit to that, as, I've not played in a band since I was in high school, and we only wrote a couple songs. We were primarily doing covers, but at that time I was just playing bass, and it was, playing bass, like, I think is easier to figure out how to play songs than it is with guitar, from what I've experienced. So now that I play guitar, like I don't have much music theory. I know major scales, I know pentatonic scales, like that's it. So for me, it's hard to figure out how to play other people's songs, because even if like when I watch like people who really understand music theory, like they can as soon as they figure out what the root chord is, they know what the scale is, and they can figure out what the other chords are based on that one chord. I can't do that. Like I have to, every chord is a challenge for me to figure out, like, okay, well, where are we going from there? You're doing it all by ear, or you're just looking it up on the internet, of course. But
Yeah, and
at that
it
time
was rote
they didn't.
memorization, and I would skip chords and play chords I knew in
Yeah.
place of the more complex versions that I couldn't play. So I found ways to cheat my way through.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
and again, I'm just a hack, but
But yeah, neither of us are anything remotely like Kurt Cobain. We're not trying to put ourselves in those kind of shoes. We're just saying,
I've been a
I
human on the
I
earth in the
understand.
country of America, and
That's right.
that's
And
where the comps
and I play
end.
guitar.
Yeah, yeah.
But yeah, but
So basically, Kurt Cobain and I are the same person. What am I talking about?
more or less, you do the same things. But yeah, that cover of "Where Did You Sleep Last Night," that's my favorite song on that album. I That's when when I first started playing guitar, that was an early song that I had to figure out how to play. It's just an incredible version.
All right, moving on. Um, In order, I guess. Now we're to Stone Temple Pilots Unplugged, which doesn't get a lot of play. Um, but the most important part of that show for me, and I'll let you go. The most important part of that show for me is number one, it debuted Big Empty,
Yeah,
which
that's
was just a phenomenal song, one of my favorite Stone Temple Pilot songs. And then the version of Creep is like Wyland has alternate vocals where he goes higher in a
mhm.
section, and that's one of the places where he debuted that vocal. And that version of Creep is that much better than the album version.
Totally agree. Totally agree on Creep. I remember. So what's funny is I don't think this was released as an album, was it? Stone Temple
Not
Pilots Unplugged.
originally.
So I don't know where
I
the Big
also had a
Empty,
VHS.
but I don't know where the Big Empty song came. But I remember them playing that on the radio, even, and that was before Purple was out. So we
So
knew
it's
that
confusing.
song.
So Big
Yeah,
Empty, by the way, my childhood friend yelled at me all the time when I would call it the Big Empty. It's just Big Empty, Andrew.
just Big
It's just
Empty.
Big Empty, okay?
Yep.
There's no the in front of it. But no, so Big Empty kind of got a few different debuts before Purple came out. It was on MTV Unplugged, and that was also on the soundtrack for The Crow
Okay. But
before it was actually released on Purple.
I specifically remember them playing the unplugged version on the radio.
Yes.
And I don't know if that was a B-side on something somewhere that radio stations had it. I really
So
don't
this was
know.
also back in the old days where um, labels would ship special edition CDs
Yeah.
to radio stations. There's a totally off topic, but when I was 18 or 19 years old, I used to do IT support for a bunch of businesses around the area through another company. It was just a summer job. But we fixed all the computers and worked on the network at this local music store. And for some reason they were on one of those mailing lists. And so they had, I think it was the single for Sugar by System of a Down, and it had 4 or 5 live tracks on there. And they let me have it, and it was one of the greatest days of my
Yeah.
life
I
because I
remember
had this bootleg that nobody else had unless you worked at a radio station.
I remember when you used to go to used CD stores, you would find the radio promos sometimes. Like they would be in the used section. I have a
And they might have extra tracks.
yeah, I have a radio promo version of "Given to Fly" from the original one that was sent. It did not have extra tracks on it, but I just remember how cool that was. That it was like because that song was so important to me as a Pearl Jam fan. Like I just remember
Yeah.
thinking how awesome it was. Like this was the first version that some radio station got. Like this is what they played on the air. So yeah, there was something definitely cool for that. But yeah, I also remember the unplugged Stone Temple Pilots, Wicked Garden, that got played on the radio too. And I think that was a B-side on something. And that version was awesome too. Like just a really great version of that song.
Yeah, Stone Temple Pilots. Someday we'll spend a longer time talking about them, but they kind of in the moment they were looked at as copycats or also rans, and then they really did establish themselves and became the genuine article sometime Purple and
Yeah.
after.
Yeah, for
Um,
sure.
so we could probably skip Bruce Springsteen. I don't really even remember his
Nope.
Unplugged. Um,
No.
I don't think you care at all about the 10,000 Maniacs Unplugged, but this is one of my absolute favorites.
Because the night.
Because the Night, which was actually a Bruce Springsteen song. But man, so 10,000 Maniacs is a band from Jamestown, New York. I've spent my entire life in the summertime up in Chautauqua, New York, which is about 25 minutes away. When I was 12 or 13, 10,000 Maniacs came and played Chautauqua, and I was in the first 5 rows, and it was just incredible. I've always loved Natalie Merchant and her voice, and so the 10,000 Maniacs Unplugged meant a lot to me personally, even if for other people it was just kind of whatever. It was actually
I just
released as an album too.
Oh yeah. I just remember Because the Night. That was a huge single off of that. Like and I actually didn't know that was a Springsteen song. I just remember literally the only thing I know about it is I just remember that 10,000 Maniacs version.
Yeah, but they just had so many kind of just catchy songs. These Are Days, Candy Everybody Wants, um, Hey Jack Kerouac, lots. I was a big fan.
Yeah, cool.
Bob Dylan did one in '94. I've never been a Dylan guy.
I don't remember that at all.
How about the Eagles?
Fucking hate the Eagles.
Fair enough. Fair enough.
I am on the Big Lebowski's side on this. I'm not an Eagles fan.
So I'm not a big Eagles fan, but I was at a lame. It wasn't lame. I was at an insurance meeting, conference or whatever, and a former Eagles guitarist brought his band in and played all the Eagles hits, and it was really good.
There you go.
So 5 feet from my face, I enjoy the Eagles.
Okay, right on.
But I wouldn't listen to a record really.
Yeah.
All right, I'm gonna skip that one. It's Los Fabulosos Cadillacs, Latin Spanish at MTV Miami.
I'm curious if you missed one that I remember, but maybe it was later than I think it was. What year are we up to here?
94.
Okay, so maybe you're coming up on it. I'm not sure.
Jimmy Page and Robert Plant.
That's exactly it. No Quarter. Yep.
Yeah, it's the next one.
Okay. That one I definitely remember. That was an enormous deal. Page and Plant reuniting. They put out the album. It's not released as a unplugged labeled album.
No.
It's called No Quarter. But it is phenomenal. It is so good. And I just, at that time, I'm in 1994. I was not an enormous Led Zeppelin fan. I certainly was familiar with them. They would play them on the radio a lot at that time, but I didn't own any of their albums yet. And so for me, that Page and Plant No Quarter was sort of an introductory period for me. Like that was like the first time I really got into them. And it was only after that I went back and like really got into all their albums. Now today, I love Led Zeppelin, but at that time I just hadn't done it. And so it was kind of cool that was the thing that kind of got me into them.
All right, this one's funny. On October 21st, 1994, Phil Collins Unplugged aired. Because of his diminishing popularity in the US, it only aired in Europe.
There we go.
I bet you can find that on YouTube. I like Phil Collins. I don't remember this. I probably would have watched it though.
I like Genesis. I'm not a crazy Phil Collins fan, but I do like Genesis.
I went through a Genesis phase where I listened to the old stuff.
Yeah.
Duke and Lamb Lies Down on Broadway.
Yeah.
Some of those old things. All right, next up, we're into 95. Hole.
Yeah, I don't remember that one, which you would think I would because I'm a huge Courtney Love fan, but I just somehow I missed that one.
Yeah. I wasn't a big Hole fan. Still not a big Hole fan. Next up, Cranberries.
So here's what I'll say about this one. I don't think they ever released it, and I think that's for a good reason. You can go on YouTube and you can like find the version of Linger from it. It is not good. It is not good. When I talk about Unplugged having the capacity to expose some bands, I think it might have exposed them a little bit, actually. It's not good.
And I do like the Cranberries, too.
I do, too.
I don't remember it.
Yeah, after the show, look it up on YouTube and check it out. It's rough.
I could play it. It would get us kicked off YouTube.
Yep.
Man, we're in some like Dead Zone stuff here. We got
it had by that point it had mostly kind of died down, the Unplugged phenomenon. Like there's not a lot of iconic performances left to talk about.
But like Live did one, I guess, and I don't remember Live doing one.
And see, this is where you get into where like I'm not even sure how many of these are like you really even consider MTV Unplugged. They're more of shows that were sponsored by MTV that they played Unplugged, but they weren't really what I consider the true brand of MTV Unplugged.
Where there was like a stage setup and a whole
Yeah.
setup.
Yeah.
So let's talk about one that was, and that's Kiss Unplugged.
Yeah, that one was certainly big. I'm not a Kiss fan, so it didn't do much for me
No,
personally, but
I'm not a Kiss fan either.
definitely remember that.
Does it ever give you pause that some of our favorite bands were big Kiss fans?
Like, dude, almost all of my favorite musicians loved Kiss. They are so,
And I don't like them at all.
I don't either. I hate them. But they are so revered by so many of my musical heroes. So there's a respect there that you know, I can respect that, and I'm thankful that they had the influence that they did on the bands that I love. But yeah, man, I don't know. Them music just didn't do it for me.
And finally, the reason that we're even having this episode,
Well,
we were going to dedicate a whole.
Let's not get to this.
Hang on.
Oh, okay.
You can correct me after I introduce it. Alice in Chains Unplugged.
You skipped a very iconic Unplugged.
Which one did I skip?
It might have happened after this. Maybe that's why.
Are you going to talk about Oasis?
Well, that's
after.
That's one that's after it is.
What'd I miss?
Alanis.
She's not even here. Why did they skip her?
Alanis Unplugged, it was like a huge album. That version of You Ought to Know, that stripped down version that's completely different from the album. It has Uninvited on it. Like, that was like the first time I ever heard Uninvited was
She
Unplugged.
didn't do it till 1999.
Really? It was that late? My timeline is all mixed up on that one. All right. Well, we can wait to talk about that one then. My bad.
No, I mean, I don't want to bury the lead. Let's talk about Alanis, and then we're going to talk about Alice in Chains for way too long.
Okay, that sounds good. But yeah, so that Alanis,
I was a big Alanis fan. I loved her first two records. I saw her live on the Jagged Little Pill tour. She had a B-side. She had a song. Was it a B-side, or I think it was a B-side called Can't Not, and she performed that thing live. I don't know where it exists in her recorded catalog, but she was just firing on all cylinders through from 95 when Jagged Little Pill came out all the way till that second album where she was like naked in the subway singing thank you. I just loved everything she did. And then I don't know, I can't remember how much later or when it happened, but then she played God in the Kevin Smith movie. I loved everything Alanis in that period.
Yeah, totally. And I thought that her Unplugged performance was an absolutely iconic performance because, again, it showed a sort of width to her ability that you maybe didn't necessarily hear to that point on her albums. And like I said, like I just remember being blown away by that version of You Ought to Know. So, the radio version or the album version of You Ought to Know is this aggressive, in your face, powerful song. And she completely stripped that thing apart and put it back together into this piano heavy, like ballad almost. And it's so powerful to hear those lyrics sang that way in that performance. That's just always stuck with me, like just how great that performance is of that song. And like I said, and Uninvited as well is a song that I think, was that on a soundtrack maybe? I don't know.
I'm not sure
because it definitely wasn't on her first two albums.
I thought it was on her second record, but I don't remember.
I don't think it was, but maybe I'm wrong. But yeah.
Oh, you're right. It was on the soundtrack for City of Angels, which was the record that broke the Goo Goo Dolls the second time.
Yeah. So, but that Unplugged version, it's just her and the piano, and it's just so beautiful.
By the way, aside, I love romantic comedies and romantic movies like City of Angels. I've always loved those kinds of movies. It's so out of character, but I loved that stupid movie, and I love the soundtrack. I like all those overdone songs, overly emotional songs. I love them all.
I actually never saw the movie. Was that Meg Ryan? Was that a Meg Ryan movie?
Meg Ryan and Nick Cage.
Yeah, I never saw the movie, but certainly was familiar, obviously, with the soundtrack because I remembered Uninvited. What was that? What's the Goo Goo Dolls song?
Iris.
Yeah, I mean, that thing was huge. I mean,
I think it's still a phenomenal song.
I did too. I always liked that song. It was a little bit, you know, corny for, you know, the style of music that was popular at that time, but it was just a powerful vocal melody on that thing.
It's a soundtrack song. You know, it's not quite as cheesy as Aerosmith doing I Don't Want to Miss a Thing.
Why is that where my mind went to? That's exactly where I was just going to mention that, like in compare and contrast.
That was Aerosmith doing a Diane Warren song.
Yeah,
you know, at least the Goo Goo Dolls wrote their own movie hits.
That was like my contrast of that was like they were both trying to do the same thing, but I think Goo Goo Dolls did it much, much better. For sure.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
All right, which is a circuitous way of getting to Alice in Chains Unplugged.
There we go.
So I don't remember the timeline of all this. You know, the band kind of felt like they were on hiatus, like they almost didn't exist. You know, there was all this speculation about Layne Staley, which we would later come to find out was true as true can be. And Alice in Chains Unplugged was the perfect opportunity for a band that had already shown that they had this muscle, you know, between Sap and Jar of Flies. They'd proven that they were already capable of being this band. And so it was the ultimate showcase for them.
So I can talk a little bit about the timeline of this. So Alice in Chains put out their self-titled album, which we call Tripod.
With the tripod dog.
Yeah, so we call it Tripod. They put that out in 95. Maybe it was 96 even. I think it was 95. Either way, they famously didn't tour on that album.
It was November 7th, 1995.
Yeah. And so they didn't tour at all on that because I know for sure Layne was not capable. I think Jerry might have even had some alcohol or drug issues going on at that exact same time. And I just know that the band just couldn't get on the same page. So they had not toured in about 2.5 years because they hadn't toured while they were writing and recording the album. You know, so there was this big break from, you know, Dirt to they put out Tripod, which is my favorite Alice in Chains album. It's probably a top 10 all-time album for me, but they didn't tour behind it. And you really got the sense that the band was falling apart. I remember just feeling like, man, this just doesn't feel like these guys are going to be around much longer. Because again, they weren't supporting their new album. And then out of the blue, I remember, I don't know if it was, so I didn't have MTV at that time, so I probably wouldn't have seen a TV ad, but somehow I heard Alice in Chains was doing MTV Unplugged. And so I called up my friend who had MTV, and I was like, dude, you have to let me come over and watch this. Like, and I don't remember what happened, but somehow it actually ended up not working out. And I didn't get to go see this performance. And the performance was on April 10th, 1996 at the Majestic Theater in Brooklyn. It aired May 28th, 96. I have no memory of why I didn't end up getting to see it, but I remember being so disappointed. And at that time, this is not like the internet existed, but it didn't exist as we know it now. There wasn't YouTube to go, you know, see all the clips. There wasn't Twitter to find all the clips. Like if you missed something,
I'm sure I was still on dial-up.
Oh, without a doubt. 96.
I was probably on CompuServe or AOL.
And so I'll tell this story about, it's not an interesting story, but this is like
way to lead them in.
I know, but like I feel like there's moments when there's albums that you remember the experience of going to get, like those are the albums that really mean something special to you. And so this album was released July 30th, 1996. And our family was on vacation in Gatlinburg, Tennessee. And this is when albums came out on Tuesdays. And I even double checked this to make sure my memory didn't fail me. I looked at the historical weather records for Gatlinburg, and I was correct. It was a rainy day on that Tuesday in Gatlinburg. And the reason I remembered that was because so there was a music shop in Gatlinburg on the main. I don't know if you've ever been to Gatlinburg, but so there's
No.
like a main stretch, like a lot of these touristy areas have, where there's just tons of different types of shops and stuff. And on the one corner, there's like this sort of mall. It's not like what you think of as a mall, but it's like, a collection of shops. And there's a record store called the Rhythm Section on the first floor, and they sold CDs. And the place that our family was staying at was probably maybe 2 miles away from that. And for whatever reason, my parents didn't want to drive. They didn't like, my parents didn't see why it was so important that I had to go get this album on that Tuesday. They're like,
Story of my life, by the way. My mom never understood why I
yeah,
just
like
needed to
they're
go.
like, you don't have to go get it now. You can get it when we get back home from vacation. And I'm like, absolutely not. I have to have this album today. Like, I was distraught that I couldn't walk there because it was pouring rain. And I remember begging so hard that finally my dad agreed to go drive. So he drove me, literally dropped me off at the side of the road. I ran into the store, bought Unplugged, came back out. I think I even spent like $18.99 on it. It was super expensive because you're in a tourist area. Like, it was incredibly expensive, but I didn't care. I was going to pay whatever it cost, and I spent the entire rest of that trip in Gatlinburg listening to this album on repeat. Like, I was just absolutely blown away, and I just have that memory like burned in my head of that experience of how important it was for me to be able to get this and to hear this album.
So I think I bought this one twice. I think it came out on CD, and then I'm reading that it was re-released as a CD DVD package in '99. I think I bought that one as well.
Okay, yeah. So I
When they
never bought the combo package. I only had the CD. And so I got rid of a lot of my CDs, but I kept like some sentimental ones that mean a lot to me. And you better believe I still own that copy of Unplugged that I bought in Gatlinburg, Tennessee, like, for sure.
So, and I don't mean to lead us down the path of superlatives, but can you imagine anything more powerful than the way they opened with Nutshell and the band's kind of playing, and then you can just hear when Layne Staley walks out of the back to take his seat and start singing in the way that only Layne Staley can. That song is such a dirge, but such a powerful, powerful song. Is there's a case to be made that you should end with that song,
So
and yet they let off with it.
so the funny thing is, so yeah, that the song starts, it's just Jerry playing the guitar, and then I can't remember if does Mike come in with the bass first or does Sean come in with the drums first. I can't remember. I might be getting those. I think the bass comes in
I think
next.
the bass comes in first,
and then the drums come in, and then Layne comes out, and then he starts singing that first verse. And I love the way they do that. And like, what it reminds me of, but is when I saw Nine Inch Nails on the Lights in the Sky tour, they did the reverse of this when they closed the show, where they're playing, and all of a sudden, Robin was playing guitar on that tour, and all of a sudden he just stops playing, takes his guitar, waves to the crowd, walks off the stage. And then Justin, oh, can't remember what his name is now, who played bass on that tour. He stops playing, takes his bass off, the drums stop playing. And eventually the show just ends with Trent standing up there all alone, playing on the piano, this slow winding thing. And then he just stops and just walks off the stage. And like, that's how you do it. But this was like the inverse of that, leading into the show. It's so powerful. And So I only own one. No, correction. I own two guitar tab books. They're both Alice in Chains. But when I first bought my acoustic guitar, I was my it was the summer after my sophomore year of college. I bought my first acoustic guitar, and I bought the Alice in Chains Unplugged tab book. And the first song I learned was Nutshell. That's the very first song that I learned how to play on my guitar, and so it has a lot of sentimental meaning to me as well for that. Like, just I absolutely love that song.
So, I mean, obviously, there are plenty of highlights from this one. Um, had you already listened to the Sap? Were you already in on Sap and
Oh yeah,
all those
oh yeah,
songs?
oh yeah,
Yeah,
yeah, yeah.
me too. I just that one was such a kind of an entry point for people who had not gone back and not
Yeah.
been Alice in Chains completists. And
Brother, I
so
was
when they heard,
excited. I was excited, like brother. I was excited to like learn that guitar solo, like because again, having that tab book, like I learned how to play that guitar solo. To this day, I still often play "Got Me Wrong" on my guitar. I love playing that song. Yeah, yeah. Those, I mean, those, especially "Got Me Wrong." "Got Me Wrong" is just such a great song. And you're right that like if you weren't all the way in on Alice in Chains, you probably hadn't heard Sap. And so it was a great way to bring a couple of those songs to the people for sure.
and I think it was also, I mean, let's not kid ourselves. The Alice in Chains Tripod record debuted at number one, and there were plenty of radio hits on that record. But this one provided some additional depth to songs like "Heaven Beside You" and "Frogs," and certainly "Over Now." The so ultimately, I'm reading here that "Killer Is Me" was originally the ending song, and it was cut from the
Right.
performance, but you couldn't end a TV show much better than "Over Now."
Yeah, which was actually the single for this album as well. It's the only single they released from this was "Over Now." Um, yeah, that I mean, it's a great album closing track, anyways. But yeah, it was a perfect way to close out this show.
A
Uh, uh,
7 minute long song.
but
Throw caution to the wind, man.
so "Killer Is Me" is interesting too. I it's one that like I don't think it's stuck with a lot of people, but I think there's something like really beautiful about that song as well. But uh, I also think that like the performance in many ways is iconic because again we were acutely aware of, well, I don't know how to say it, Layne's condition.
Yeah.
He was deteriorating by that point. Um,
He looked so frail. He looked just awful
and
on
there's
that
just
broadcast.
something about though, like that setting with all the candles on the stage. And I read that Layne actually bought those candles himself, that was his idea. He went to the Pike Place Market and bought all those candles and used them for the stage set. But there was just something there's still something that like, so we were aware that Layne wasn't in the best health. You can certainly tell by looking at him, and if you read about it, I think they said it took about 3 hours to record this performance because there were some retakes they had to do of songs. But the performance that we hear on that CD, Layne sounds so good. Like when you listen to Down in a Hole and he just goes for it, or even like Got Me Wrong, like when they're harmonizing and Layne's just crushing that high part, like he sounds so good on this. So like listening to the CD, I think that's what was like still like so striking to me was how good he sounded for all the rumors. Like it gave us hope that like, hey, maybe these guys still have, something left to them. Now, unfortunately, that wouldn't prove to be the case, but just to get this one last great iconic performance out of Layne is really special to me. And that's another part of reason why this album means so much to me personally.
Yeah, well, and the Nirvana Unplugged was redefined after Kurt Cobain's death, and Alice in Chains Unplugged was certainly redefined after Layne Staley's death. And in the moment, it felt kind of like a funeral. Let's be honest.
It
It,
feels
it
in our like,
it was a warning shot.
and it feels like oh man, Layne. Like a part of me still thinks like, oh yeah, Layne died shortly after this, but he actually didn't. I think it was like
It was
what
6 years later.
6 years later. But this, I mean, so after this aired, they did this performance that summer. They opened for Kiss on Alice in Chains did on a handful of shows, and that was it. That was the last time they ever toured. Layne would do vocals for a couple songs for the what was that box
The
set?
music box.
Music Bank.
Music Bank.
Music Bank. He did Died and Get Born Again. And honestly, like, he sounds pretty good on those too. And if you see pictures of him from when they recorded those, like, I don't even hardly recommend looking it up if you don't know already what he looked like at that time. But he doesn't even look like this. Literally doesn't look like the same person. It's so heartbreaking to see what he looked like. But that was even still in like 99. He lived it like 3 more years in isolation after that, but he was doing almost nothing after that. So like this album kind of stands for all intents and purposes as the closing chapter of Layne Staley and Alice in Chains, or that iteration of Alice in Chains. And it's, I don't know, it's heartbreaking, but it's also like there's something just genuine and sweet about the performance. Like, I love like when Layne's like, oh, he's like, this is the best show we've played in 3 years or something like that. And they're like, Layne, it's the only show we played. And he's like, well, it's still the best, or I like to, he's like, at one point Layne says, he's thanking the crowd for being there. He's like, we're going to have some fun tonight. We're going to play some good songs for you. And I always love that because I'm like, well, yeah, I hope you're going to play good songs. Don't play bad songs, like, but it was just like, I don't know. There's something sweet and endearing about it. And like, that's kind of who Layne was anyways. Like the people talk all the time about the dichotomy of like, so he writes these like heartbreaking songs. He has this powerful voice, but he was like the sweetest guy ever. And you sort of see all those sides of Layne in this performance as well.
Well, and then we come to find out later that he wrote on his bass, "Friends don't let friends cut their hair" or whatever.
Yeah,
And that
for
was
Metallica.
because the guys from Metallica were in the audience and they'd cut their hair.
And that was a big deal.
Yeah, it was a huge deal. But no, this felt like a window into the soul of that band. And
Yeah.
it felt like it humanized them in a way that the music videos of that day just didn't humanize bands. It put them on pedestals. It was shiny. There were fast cuts. You didn't feel like you got to know these guys. And this was pre-social media. Bands didn't have YouTube channels where they gave interviews. And so these were our rock gods. These were the people that we revered and loved and had unhealthy personal relationships, even though we didn't have personal relationships with them. But Unplugged felt like we were getting to know them in a way that we couldn't in any other format, including, you think about when they had Radiohead come and play the MTV Beach House, right? And so they pop in on Radiohead, they do 4 minutes of this weird performance next to a swimming pool, and then they're out. Mm-hmm. But it was long form. It was stripped down. Yeah. It was in an environment that you weren't used to seeing them with, instruments you probably weren't used to seeing them play.
Yeah.
And it was just everything.
We should talk too a little bit that meant talking about the instrumentation. So they bring out Scott Olson to play guitar with them on this. And this is the first time they had ever played a show as a 5-piece, actually. So traditionally, when they would, even though on their albums, Jerry would often play multiple guitar parts. And when Layne was healthy, Layne would play some guitar live. He was not a great guitarist by any means, but he would play what he could. But at this point, there was no way Layne was going to play guitar in this show. And so they brought out Scott Olson to play. And I actually have a quote here from Jerry that I'll read that I kind of like. He said, "We certainly have enough material and we could have done it a while ago. But to be honest with you, man, TV scares me. It's hard to sound good on TV, especially for a band like ours that is a little raw and rough at times. It helped me to have a friend of ours, Scott Olson, on stage playing guitar during the tape-in. It widened the sound a bit, and he was beneficial to the show." And I think that is just so absolutely true. Listening to the space between those two guitars is really underappreciated. And I don't remember this album being poorly reviewed, but in doing research for this, I read that it got a lot of negative reviews for people who were saying that they didn't do anything different, that they said they were just
stupid Pitchfork.
And
it was Pitchfork, wasn't it?
It was not Pitchfork, not 96. But
let's blame them anyway.
Yeah, screw you, Pitchfork. But no, and I find it insane to me that people listen to this, and I'm not going to sit here on any kind of pedestal, but like, it kind of makes me think these are people who don't have a great understanding of what they were doing with the guitars on this, because so most of the time when you would hear a lot of these songs played live, it was really just Jerry playing his part. And on the albums, there was often multiple guitar parts that Jerry would play, and you would lose some of that live. Now, it doesn't matter because Jerry's such a good guitar player and they were such a powerful band that he could just play his parts and you'd get the point of these songs across. But on this unplugged stage, they needed to fill that extra space. And,
especially with something like Down in a Hole.
Yeah, absolutely. And, even like, some of the solos, if Scott Olson isn't there providing some of the extra guitars, it's going to sound a little hollow when Jerry's playing the solos on an acoustic, because Jerry didn't write these as acoustic solos. Like, so when people perform an acoustic guitar solo, like, you usually have to be mindful of that space, but Jerry was playing these as though they were electric solos, so it helped so much to have Scott Olson there playing some of these. And I looked up Scott Olson because I was like kind of curious who he actually was, and I actually didn't know this before today, but he played with Heart for a little bit. He was
another Seattle band, by the way.
Yeah. He was a recording engineer on the Deftones album White Pony. He played guitar on Change in the House of Flies from the B-Sides Deftones album. So he actually played on a Deftones song. He was the engineer up for Limp Bizkit on Chocolate Starfish. So like, this is he worked on Buck Cherry album. Like, this is a guy who's like actually like done a lot of things. And we can roll our eyes at like Buck Cherry and Chocolate Starfish and all this, but like, he was an accomplished guy who actually did a lot. But he worked on almost every Alice in Chains album. He was an engineer. I think he was even their tech guy for a while. He kind of did a lot of different things for Alice in Chains, and unfortunately, he was diagnosed with dementia a few years back, and Alice in Chains had put together a GoFundMe for him to help support that. So I was kind of sad to see that, because these guys who like made a lasting contribution to an album that means a lot to me, like Scott Olson, is very important to this album. And it was like really sad to find out, like, that he wasn't doing well. But
you make a giant impact in the 90s, right? Mm-hmm. And you're this somewhat influential figure, even if you're on the back burner a little bit.
Yeah,
it's not like these people end up with FU money.
Right, exactly. I'm sure he was not making a lot of money as a sound engineer on these albums, but yeah, I think too, like, as much as people will say, oh, well, they just did, the songs from Sap and Jar of Flies that were already made to be acoustic anyways. Well, that's true, but they played Sludge Factory. Like, they did Wood like that. Like
Yeah.
they mixed in some like interesting stuff with this as well.
And I'm sorry, Rooster was an electric song, but
Yeah,
I wanted to hear the acoustic
and
version
they
of that. I wanted to
translated
hear
that
it stripped down a little
so
bit.
well. Yeah, and boy, that's another one. Like listening to the interplay of the vocals between Jerry and Layne. Like I've just, I've really been listening to this album a lot over this last week in preparation for this episode, and like just going back and listening to those two sing together. Like I like William Duvall, and I've really enjoyed a lot of the music Alice in Chains has put out.
By the way, William Duvall is the new singer for Alice in Chains. For those who don't know,
Right. Sorry.
he's a phenomenal singer. He currently tours with the band whenever they still play.
Yep.
And he's done 2 or 3 albums.
I think
They've done
he's
3
done
albums with
3
him.
albums. He's did Black Gives Way to Blue, Devil Put Dinosaurs Here, and Rainier Fog. So he did 3 albums with them already.
And I admit, man, I haven't kept up with William Duvall, Alice in Chains, but I've seen them live.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not me being a dick. I just haven't kept up with it. He's a phenomenal live performer.
Their tours, their shows are really good. I've seen them as well. And they do a great job of staying true to the spirit of those original Alice in Chains songs. But they mix in some of the new stuff with it as well. It's a really powerful performance. But I actually do listen. I don't like The Devil Put Dinosaurs Here. Like that one, I didn't really get into that much. But Black Gives Way to Blue, I really loved. Rainier Fog, I thought was an excellent album. But I'm not, in no way am I disparaging William, but like just going back and hearing the way Jerry and Layne would trade off vocals, you just don't get that to quite that same degree. Like the way those voices layered and just sat on top of each other. And like I said, then they would trade off. Jerry would sing a part and Layne would sing a part, and then they would just crash together. You always had Jerry on the bottom and Layne on the top. Like there's just nothing like it.
By the way, when Jerry tours his solo material, he tours with Greg Puciato from Dillinger Escape Plan, and those two sing wonderfully together as well.
Mm-hmm.
But it's still not the same.
Yeah, it'll never be the same.
Awesome.
That's what we lost, and that's again why an album like this is so powerful, because it's not only is it enjoyable to listen to, but it's just a strong, powerful reminder of what we lost. But I wanted to also real quick mention to talking though about the song selection here, and that some people criticize some of it. I actually saw that Jerry said that they strongly considered playing both Love, Hate, Love and We Die Young. And God, I wish they would have played We Die Young. Oh, I would have loved to have heard what they could have done with an acoustic version of that. But for whatever reason, it didn't work out, and they didn't end up doing it. But I really don't have a complaint about the song selection for this. It had most of the things I wanted to hear. I loved hearing Sludge Factory. I loved hearing Frogs.
I didn't realize they didn't play a single song from Facelift.
Right. It's the only one that
I should have realized, but I didn't.
Yeah, it's the only one that was not represented.
It's like seeing Tool live today. They don't play anything.
Right, exactly. I really wish I could have figured out a way to do Man in the Box. Like,
yeah.
But yeah,
that's pretty funny. Well, it's how crazy is it that they essentially don't do MTV Unplugged anymore in the YouTube generation?
Yeah.
There are plenty of smaller brands or smaller labels that do live performances. I think you and I have mentioned Tiny Desk from NPR from time to time. Yep. Audio Tree. Some of my favorite indie rock bands have played Audio Tree live, which is phenomenal.
Yep.
None of those things I don't think would exist without Unplugged.
No, for sure. I mean, Unplugged has a lasting legacy in that even bands who don't do quote unquote MTV Unplugged, a lot of bands are doing one-off acoustic shows, and it's all in the spirit of what MTV Unplugged brought to this. I specifically am thinking of like a band like Foo Fighters. Like Foo Fighters never did proper unplugged, but they've certainly done unplugged shows.
Mostly on the Howard Stern show.
Yeah. I'm trying to think. Metallica, S&M, they did that whole thing. Maybe they would have done it had Unplugged never existed. I don't know, but I feel like Unplugged had to have been sort of the genesis of that idea of Metallica saying like, okay, well, what can we do but make it a little bit different? Rather than acoustic, we're going to go orchestral.
Yeah, and maybe it's me too. I'm reading here that Florence and the Machine did an Unplugged on April in 2012. Bleachers did one as recently as 2017.
So they do still. They've got some. But again, like I said, I feel like that's still more of a MTV sponsoring a show rather than a proper like TV production.
Yeah, because Liam Gallagher did one, and it's MTV Unplugged live at Hull City Hall. Yeah. So it's essentially just lending MTV Unplugged to a different show.
We touched on you mentioned Oasis before. We should real quick talk a little bit about what happened with their Unplugged performance. So this is one. It's such a disappointment of mine that this didn't come to fruition. But they were scheduled to do actual MTV Unplugged. And the day of the show, Liam, I don't know, there was something going on between Liam and Noel. I don't know if they got in a fight or whatever. And then Liam claimed he was too sick to perform. So Noel went out and sang all the songs. So Noel would frequently sing with Oasis. Like there's songs where he is the lead, does sing lead. He also does a lot of the harmonies and stuff. So it's not like it was totally crazy for Noel to sing, but he did all of Liam's parts as well. But famously, Liam sat in the stands and heckled the band throughout the entire show. And they had to cut so much of it because Noel was bickering with Liam, telling him to shut up and F off and all this. And so it got scrapped and it was never properly put out. I would have killed for a proper Oasis Unplugged album. But, that's the Gallagher brother. That's the experience of being an Oasis fan. Like,
yeah, that is the Oasis experience. Yeah. That's the genuine article, as they say.
That's right.
All right, you got anything else for the good of the order? I mean, this time next week, we're going to be talking about a lot of new music. Or not, I guess, this time. We're going to have to delay next week's recording.
We'll see. We'll have something in store. I'm going to be hearing the new Pearl Jam album on Tuesday. I'm going to the theater experience to hear it. Depending on whether there are means by which Craig hears the album, we may do a proper episode, or else maybe I'll do something
emergency pod.
Or else I may do something solo just to give some impressions of the album. We want to get some content out there for you guys.
I'm just going to say this. Look, we live in 2024. Everybody's going to stream this album. The pre-sales are done. People have bought their vinyl. It's time to leak this thing.
Absolutely.
Like it's 1999.
Leak it.
Okay. It's like Napster. We need to get back to the Napster days. We need to leak this album. I need to be hearing it. I'm reading reviews. People have review copies. I don't know what's going on. Somebody record it off your sound card, upload the MP3s. We're all going to listen to it. That's and then we're going to keep paying for Spotify or Tidal or whatever it is we pay for. And they're going to get their money. It's time to leak the record.
Yep. We need to hear it. It's time. I'm tired of waiting. But yeah, so next week we'll have some Pearl Jam content for you guys for sure.
Or we won't. We'll only talk about Cloud Nothings, and you'll like it.
Hey, that's going to have to be talked about as well. So
it will.
And Taylor Swift.
All right, well,
and don't forget about Taylor Swift.
Oh, the Dead Poets Society, whatever club.
That
something
can't be what it's called, but
something poets.
There is a poet for sure. Tortured. Yes.
Tortured Dead Poets
Society of Clubs.
Societies. Gonna make $1 billion. That's what it's gonna.
That's right. I mean, if we really want to grow this episode or this podcast, we probably should talk about the Taylor Swift album. That's the key.
Yeah, that's actually probably true. But if we cared about success, we wouldn't be podcasting at all.
That's right. Well said.
All right. Well, thanks so much for listening, everybody. We will talk to you next time. It's the Album of Record podcast.